Students with disabilities often hold high aspirations for adulthood. Their visions for a good life after graduating, they often revolve around landing a satisfying job or finding a good place to live, making friends, being part of the community, and contributing in ways that make life better for others. It turns out that each of these aspirations is really an important aspect of living an enjoyable and maybe even an enviable life. Well, when students with significant disabilities are connected to meaningful work experiences in their communities, then achieving all those other outcomes and aspirations becomes all the more likely. In addition to a paycheck, a good job brings this sense of accomplishment and self-worth and independence. It gives young people a place to share their strengths and their gifts in valued ways. It fosters new friendships in the workplace. And it provides resources and connections that increase community involvement and bolster community contributions. You know, a good job brings so many benefits. And I bet you can personally relate to this point. I bet most of you watching this webinar can actually remember back to your own early work experiences, way back in high school, maybe even for some of you back in middle school. Maybe you had an informal job like babysitting or mowing lawns or helping out around the neighborhood, for example. Or maybe you worked in fast food, or you took tickets at the movie theater, or you stocked shelves at a retail store, or you're a fry cook at the local fast food restaurant, or maybe you were a counselor at a summer camp. For me, it was actually selling newspapers door to door in middle school, which is now, it turns out, a completely obsolete job. And then I moved on to bagging groceries and stocking shelves at Giant Foods in Middle Georgia. Working during high school is a pretty typical experience. It's what most youth do. It's what most of you did as well. The question for us is, how can we make this more typical for students with significant disabilities? So that will be the focus of this webinar within the Pathways to Employment series, where you'll learn about the positive impact of working during high school. You'll recognize the various barriers that can often stand in the way of this pursuit. You'll learn how to develop a plan for pursuing employment, paid employment in the community, and you'll understand how to evaluate the quality of employment experiences that your students have. So let's begin by watching another short video. It'll resemble one you've already seen, again, where young people with developmental disabilities were asked what they want to do when it comes to the world of work. And I want you to notice the ordinary answers they give and think back to how a younger you might have responded to this question.
Can you look at the camera and smile?
Yes.
All right, Sean, can you smile for the camera?
Maybe.
What do you want to be when you grow up?
I work in nurse home. Oh, to work with horses.
I want to work at Hawaii Cafe.
I would like to work at Brentwood YMCA. Cook.
Yes.
Chef.
Yes.
Work at Chick-fil-A or Publix one day.
I want to be a baseball scout.
Well, either I want to be a national police officer or have my own store, be a store manager.
A vet.
That's me though. Me though.
Take a step forward, please.
That's Miss Queen though.
Okay.
Miss Queen though. Miss Queen.
Clearly, young people with disabilities expect to find a home in the workplace. And that's true also for students with developmental disabilities or significant disabilities. And the available research affirms what we hear sort of in the stories of our students, that working at some point during high school can have a positive, even a powerful effect. And let me illustrate this with just a few examples. It turns out that work doubles or triples the odds of integrated employment after graduation. In other words, for youth with disabilities, obtaining meaningful work during high school is a strong predictor of favorable post-school employment outcomes. In other words, if you can connect your students to school-sponsored work experiences and vocational classes and help them connect to after-school or summer jobs, that significantly increases their odds of obtaining work after completing high school. But it's more than that. It also raises the aspirations of young people with disabilities. They catch a glimpse of what life is like in the workplace, and they aspire to more and to continue that path well beyond high school. I think a good work experience also demonstrates their capacity to work. And so many people wonder about whether kids with significant disabilities really can contribute in the workplace. And so by seeing it firsthand and demonstrating that it's possible, it starts to change parent expectations and teacher expectations. We talked about this in the first webinar. Experiences change expectations, and expectations change experiences. But it also puts real experience on resumes. It proves to future employers that this is a person who has worked and done so successfully. It also, in the act of working at various businesses, gives them much more compelling references. When other employers can, in essence, testify to the contributions this young person's made, that speaks volumes to other employers. It also teaches students skills and knowledge that we just can't simulate in the school or in the classroom. And most of all, it connects students to future employers. Perhaps the job you get them in their final year of schooling ends up being the job that they're able to maintain into early adulthood. So you can see that early work experiences, if we design them well and appropriately support them, they can make a really powerful contribution to positive adolescent development. The experiences of finding and maintaining a job, for example, that helps build students' autonomy and self-determination. It influences their vocational identity. It shapes their career aspirations. It helps them develop really important workplace skills and knowledge and values. And it promotes collateral skills like interpersonal skills and money management skills and personal management skills. But most of all, those direct work experiences build their resumes. It connects them with employers. It raises expectations. And we hope that all those experiences carry forward into adulthood after graduation. So Tim Reeson and his colleagues proposed a general timeline for when various work-based learning activities might take place. For example, 9th grade is a great time to do job shadowing, where a student observes some established employee to learn about various job tasks and workplace cultures. And then in 10th through 12th grade, students might participate in service learning, in which they volunteer in the community or within social programs that are aligned to their transition goals and their plan. And then job sampling, which really involves applied short-term work in community businesses, that also gives students a way in an actual workplace to prepare them for, prepare them to help them learn all the potential tasks and social skills and about the work environment. It doesn't benefit the business directly, but it's something that really benefits the students in terms of exposing them to those real life experiences. And that can take place from 10th grade all the way up through the end of an 18 to 21-year-old community-based program. Then apprenticeships, really, which involve formal work experiences that end up preparing students for highly skilled trades, that can also take place in their senior year or throughout a community-based program. And that can be paid or unpaid internships. But the essence of those is that students are engaging in formal but temporary work experiences that provide them a chance to learn about workplace culture and interpersonal interactions in the workplace and job requirements. But the most impactful of all of these kinds of experiences, as we've talked about already, is really paid employment. And that can take place from during the school day or after school or on the weekends or during summer break, as we talked about in the last session. And these experiences can take place from 10th grade or whenever they turn 16 or are working age, all the way up through high school exit. And what a valuable experience that can be for our students. But also, we really struggle to make this happen in widespread ways. It's still the exception rather than the rule for our students. Well, according to the most recent National Longitudinal Transition Study, only 1/3 of high school students with intellectual disability had a paid work experience. And that was true for just 1 in 5 youth with multiple disabilities and 1 in 4 youth on the autism spectrum. So what is it that's kind of standing in the way of more students with significant disabilities finding a job? Well, in one of our current studies, we've interviewed representatives from 5 stakeholder groups and asked them about what keeps people from pursuing paid employment before graduation or hinders students' ability to obtain it. Now, this group included parents and teachers and school district leaders and adult agency staff, including pre-employment transition services providers, and also local employers. Now, the most relevant interview questions we asked were, what things make it hard for your students or your family member to find or keep integrated employment? And which of these barriers do you consider to be most challenging? And I just want to share a snapshot of what we heard in these areas. It actually fell within these 6 overarching categories of schools, students with disabilities, families, communities, service systems, and workplaces. And in the area of schools, participants talked about 11 distinct challenges that fall under the purview of local schools. This included staffing, where schools lacked the necessary staff positions for transition or experienced high levels of staff turnover. Teachers also didn't always feel adequately equipped or supported by administration to address employment well. Some schools had limited planning discussions or assessment around employment. Others have these kind of formal or kind of unwritten policies that inadvertently hinder career preparation or student employment. Sometimes teachers struggle to incorporate employment instruction into students' school days amidst all the competing demands around academics. Other schools talked about just lacking sufficient funding to provide transportation or job coaching or materials or equipment around the employment of students with significant disabilities. Others talked about the ways that students and staff are actually grouped in classes or programs that really hinder student employment and make it difficult to meet all of the students' needs. Others talked about students with disabilities really having very limited access to career and technical education, instruction, and experience. And we've talked about why that's such a missed opportunity because of the rich array of opportunities most schools offer, but students with significant disabilities aren't invited or supported to be part of. We also know that some teachers just don't expect their students with significant disabilities to become employed. And of course, that shapes everything they do in terms of their planning and instruction. And finally, schools provide students with significant disabilities with limited or no opportunities to learn work skills in the community. As one transition teacher explained, she said, I have about 8 kids that go out for work-based learning, but because I'm the only one in the building that's trained, it's only me and my para that are the ones that can go. So it's not like I can have kids going to different job sites. I have to find one site and all of us go. And it's an example of things that prevent the kind of individualization that's so important for our students. Well, with regard to students, 8 different issues were named. Students were said to have difficulties in the areas of soft skills and communication skills, in the area of executive functioning and physical skills. And those were issues that could lead to making certain workplaces seem unsafe. Others noted that some students just don't want to work, or maybe they lack the confidence that they could be successful on the job. Others exhibited challenging behaviors that could prevent successful employment. And we know what an impact having challenging behavior can have on so many experiences and outcomes. Or sometimes students just didn't meet the formal requirements for obtaining certain jobs. They didn't have they were not of yet the right age, or they didn't have the right certifications to be able to do that as well. So it wasn't just barriers related to schools and students. They also talked about some of the barriers tied to families of youth with significant disabilities. And perhaps some of these are ones you've experienced as well. They're parents who are concerned that their child would be harmed or cause harm at the workplace. They're really worried about safety issues. Some are concerned about the loss of government benefits if their child obtained employment. So you have to talk with them about how they can actually increase the income when you combine that with benefits counseling as well. Some parents don't actively participate in their child's transition education, and so they're pretty disconnected And that's hard to do the kind of planning that needs to spill over beyond the school day. Other families talked about just navigating other life challenges, not related to employment, but scheduling and life happening and career changes and other kids that just impede their child from working. Some parents were pretty protective and limited the opportunities for their students to develop and exercise independent skills. They just have trouble releasing them into the world. Others talked about families lacking the skills or the supports or motivation necessary to really effectively advocate for their child to be in the workplace. And finally, some families just struggled to figure out how conservatorship impacts their child's employment process. They've never heard of things like supported decision making. So we've heard this from many, many families, certainly, but one vocational rehabilitation staff really illustrated this. They said, I've had a student that really, really wanted to work, but mom was just adamant. Oh no, somebody's going to take advantage of them. They can't do that. I can't leave them out there by themselves. Somebody will talk them into something. And it's not that I'm saying that parents don't have reasons to think this, but it's so bad that they don't even want to try. And so we've got to really work on families and support them in this area to help them come to a degree of recognition and support for this work as well. But there's also barriers that exist in the workplace or are linked back to employers. These often centered on things like employers and employees being really unsure of how to work with people with significant disabilities and how that might actually benefit their business. Other employers were concerned about legal issues, about having job coaches in the workplace or student safety or a policy in the workplace regarding whether or not to hire students at all. Others talked about the absence of anyone available to provide that job coaching to support youth with significant disabilities in the workplace. And many of our students will need that on-the-job support. Now, even when the ordinary support of coworkers or peers or mentor or others in the workplace really aren't available always to youth with significant disabilities. And so that's a concern of how do you build that natural support as well. And some employers were said to just be unwilling to pay youth for their work, or they wanted to pay below minimum wage. And so they're fine with job sampling and they're fine with unpaid training experiences, but they're reluctant to actually pay employees. And we've got to work against that right from the beginning. Others were said to be unwilling to create opportunities for students to try jobs or developing new positions through job carving. It's just not something they've done before and they need guidance. And finally, some workplaces still don't meet accessibility standards and they just won't provide the adaptations and supports needed by youth who have complex support needs. Now, they also identified a number of challenges related to our adult service system. And I think, the adult service system would really be a key partner in this area of employment. But they talked about challenges like difficulties knowing which services are actually available to students with significant disabilities or even how to access them. They talked about the understaffing, or having staff who just lack strong training to deliver high quality employment services and supports. They talked about the unavailability of pre-employment transition services or pre-ETS for students with significant disabilities or the lack of alignment of pre-ETS to their student specific needs. And again, there's lack of individualization often within pre-ETS. They talked about prevailing policies within agencies that just make it more difficult to serve youth with significant disabilities. And then agencies also often have limited funding to market or to provide services and supports to students who are seeking employment. And of course, students with significant disabilities often lose access to services for employment once they graduate from high school. And that halting of services or that delay or wait list for that service can be a thing that prevents that job from continuing. And of course, issues around educating students and their families around adult services and agencies is a huge issue. And we've talked before about families just not knowing what's available after high school. We talked with one vocational rehabilitation staff who shared, I could absolutely provide a 15 or 16-year-old a job, but then I'm stepping on my pre-ET specialist toes and I could get in trouble for that. I'm told, no, you need to hold off until they've graduated. You don't even bother with them until they've graduated. And that's a problem because these experiences and services could be and should be braided in ways that sort of the day before graduation looks the same as the day after graduation in terms of who's involved in supporting students. And finally, there's a few barriers, of course, related to our communities that surround our schools. Sometimes local residents just display limited understanding or acceptance of students with significant disabilities. In other communities, particularly rural ones, there are often few opportunities for employment that exist in the community for anyone, whether or not they have a disability. They're just in the midst of employment challenges overall. And so it's hard to think about how do they fit students with significant disabilities into that mix. And of course, there's transportation. When students have limited or no access to safe and reliable and cost-effective rideshare options or other kinds of options, that really limits whether they can ever get to a workplace at all. This is a portrait of barriers that we have to be aware of and we have to work hard to address. And unless you wonder what the pathway through these barriers might be, let me also share with you what these same transition stakeholders shared about the practices that can lead right through them to paid employment for students with significant disabilities. We talked with them about actually 9 different factors that can really impact making employment possible. Things like strong instruction and transportation, training and info sharing, staffing, mindsets, hands-on experiences, individualization, student supports, and collaboration. So let's talk about the area in which work-related instruction should be provided to students with significant disabilities. You see, many recommended providing career planning that's focused on helping youth engage in career awareness and exploration. They also recommended providing employment instruction, such as teaching collateral skills like soft skills or executive functioning skills or social skills that have relevance across career fields. They talked about teaching youth to make eye contact in the workplace, to follow workplace rules like cell phone etiquette and arriving to work on time and maintaining a professional appearance. They talked about getting along with coworkers and supervisors and teaching them to persist through difficult tasks. Moreover, several people spoke about the importance of supporting youth in preparing for job applications by developing a resume and practicing interview skills, completing applications, developing technology or computer skills, or obtaining the necessary identification documents that youth will need to actually get that job. And finally, a few educators talked about teaching youth to set goals and to monitor progress, or on equipping youth to identify and self-advocate for needed supports on the job. One agency provider we spoke with described the questions every youth should be ready to answer. What are different careers? What are they interested in? What does it take to get the job you want? Then what are some of the jobs you can get along the way to get you to maybe that fancy job you want someday? Well, they also identified 6 areas in which collaborations should be pursued or strengthened to promote employment. They recommended things like communicating and partnering and sharing success stories with businesses in new ways to help youth with significant disabilities become employed. We'll discuss this further in a later webinar in the Pathways to Employment series. They talked about communicating and partnering with agencies that are providing services that help youth become employed, like vocational rehabilitation staff or pre-employment transition services providers, or even just local employment providers. Likewise, they advocated for improving communication and partnerships with families in new ways to build trust, to receive parent input, to work as a team to support employing youth. They recommended creating partnerships with community members and organizations in new ways to support youth in finding and sustaining paid employment. And that would include things like service organizations or chambers of commerce or even local employment networks or programs. They also suggested partnering with school personnel across departments in new ways to help youth with disabilities become employed. Things like access to vocational or CTE courses, access to extracurriculars or general education classes or electives. And they also talked about utilizing current collaborations all the more to use partnerships that already exist as a mechanism to help youth find and sustain employment. They also identified 4 areas of support that would enable youth with significant disabilities to experience success in the workplace. So these are things like providing youth with trained job coaches for providing adequate support at job sites for as long as is necessary. And this requires being intentional about how you prepare your professionals or other staff to support your students in the workplace. They talked about providing youth with access to peers, to coworkers, to mentors at work sites who could support them as they work. This is called building natural supports, and it does require providing training and modeling and coaching and guidance on how to do this in effective and also non-intrusive ways. They talked about supporting families to learn how to assist their children to find employment, to maintain the skills they're learning, and to connect to those adult services. And this could come through hosting workshops or informational meetings with families. And finally, make sure to identify and implement accommodations and environmental modifications that will support the students on the job. This too, you'll hear more about in a later webinar. So as I talked about way back in the first webinar, individualization has to be the hallmark of all transition programming. And that's especially true in the area of employment. And so these stakeholders talked about the importance of things like matching youth with jobs that are appropriate for their skill sets and their interests. They talked about individualizing and customizing and creating distinct job opportunities for each student you serve. They talked about using transition assessment to understand each student's skills and strengths and abilities and areas of growth. And that too we talked about in the second webinar. And finally, they emphasized holding person-focused planning sessions for youth with disabilities. And I'm going to share an example of a planning tool that you could use in just a few minutes as well. Hands-on experiences, as we've talked about, lead to real-life jobs in the community. So they recommended looking for ways to connect your students with community-based work experiences where students access opportunities for paid or even unpaid work experiences at community-based job sites. But they also emphasize considering how you would provide youth with opportunities to get paid employment at or through the school in some way. So thinking about school-sponsored work experiences. And one community employer really emphasized this. They said, having the hands-on skills is just so important. And seeing that the progress that my students have made, that was just so evident, and it's really exciting and fun to see them working together. We came up to these job sites, and they actually get to physically do the work and really train alongside other employees. And it's just, well, they just learn so much faster that way. Well, participants also talked about the importance of the views about people hold around employment, and particularly the employment of youth with significant disabilities, and how that ends up shaping the opportunities and the instruction and the supports that we provide. They urged the adoption of attitudes and mindsets that could really impact the pursuit of paid work. This included things like supporting families in believing that their youth can transition to employment, providing youth with kind of incentives and motivation to work. They talked about emphasizing youth strengths rather than their challenges, a topic we also covered in the first session. They talked about providing awareness of disability through community exposure and youth inclusion within the communities. They talked about providing employers with support and incentives to hire youth with disabilities, and really trying to promote paid employment and this kind of career trajectory for youth with disabilities to become an expected part of the culture of the school. And finally, they advocated for embedding vocational education in courses of studies and to find that right balance between academics and employment preparation. Now, the need for school staffing models to implement so many of the other strategies was also addressed over and over. And of course, this is a school or district level decision, but it matters immensely. Everyone we spoke with recommended providing dedicated staff who could serve as a transition liaison for youth or their families or educators or agencies to businesses and other stakeholders as well. They really suggested providing support to staff for preparing youth for employment, and they advocated for increasing the number of staff that serve youth transitioning into paid employment, whether that's teachers or providers or job coach staff or support staff in other ways. Now, this also extended to transportation, and that is certainly an issue as well that we want to make sure that we're addressing. Training and information for students and their families. They talked about training and informing families, but by providing families with training and instruction on career planning for their youth and the agencies and supports that are available in the community that they can draw upon. They talked about providing employers and coworkers with training to support youth development in employment, and providing school staff with relevant and quality training around supporting their youth to access employment. And of course, they also emphasize that agency providers need the same kind of training. They need training on how to work with youth. That's different than working with adults, and helping those youth access employment as well. And of course, as we talked about earlier, everyone acknowledged that providing youth with access to transportation is really requisite to successful employment. Youth are said to need a variety of safe and reliable and accessible transportation options. And of course, this requires thinking really creatively about alternative ride options for students who can't drive. But they also talked about travel training to students and also to their families, knowing that this would look different for each student based on their needs. But that kind of training is also just really, really, really important and essential. So what does all this look like for a particular student with disabilities? Well, my team and I are in the midst of this multi-year project that's aimed at connecting students with significant disabilities to paid community employment during their final year of public schooling. And one key feature of this project involves hosting an employment-focused planning meeting that addresses key aspects of instruction and supports and connections that could really accelerate the road to paid employment. So I want to walk you through what this planning process looks like, and then encourage you to think about how you might incorporate something like this even into your own work with students. So there are actually 5 pages to the tool. It spans these 7 areas. And so it's a little bit longer than the other tools that I've shared with you as well. But as with planning for summer employment, for example, we really encourage youth with significant disabilities and their families and their teachers to be part of the conversation. And we would also emphasize the value of involving CTE staff and adult service providers such as VR or an employment agency or others in the community who really understand the local employment landscape. Now, the first section really centers on the student's strengths and interests. And, knowing where a student shines and where their job interests lie, that really is critical to finding just the right job match. So there's some guiding questions that you might include in those conversations. Things like, what are you really good at? What do people compliment you on? What do you like to do in your spare time? What kind of job would you like to have? And what types of jobs sound really interesting to you? What types of jobs or work experiences have you had in the past? And which of those jobs did you enjoy the most? And which do you never, ever want to do again? And these questions are really best answered by the student whenever possible, of course, with input and insights from others who are part of the team. Well, step 2 involves identifying the student's employment goals for the upcoming year. Some students are going to have a ready answer for this, and others are going to need a lot of guidance and help along the way. So there's some example discussion questions that you could use, which include things like, do you want a job where you're talking to customers or working with a team or working by yourself or working outside versus inside? What's really important to you in a job? What types of jobs or activities would you definitely not want to do? And what are some places in the community where you think you might like to work? And what are the top 3 jobs that you'd like to have? So this really helps facilitate the conversation. And again, the student is answering as much as possible, but so are other people who know them well and can speak into this issue. Now, the third section really focuses on transportation and scheduling. And we talked about the importance of that already. You've got to find jobs that work within the overall family schedule and one that's accessible through some form of transportation. These are really important considerations. So think about the following discussion questions. What transportation are you planning to use to get to work? Is it public transportation or a family member or a ride share or walking or riding your bike or something else altogether? What help will you need with transition or transportation? And what are the areas of the community that are easy for you to get to? And what days or times work best for your schedule? Well, section 4 really focuses on students' support needs, and it's broken up into 2 subsections. Now, the first of those sections really focuses on the support that students with significant disabilities are going to need to find a job. And in fact, we know that most of our students with significant disabilities are going to need that kind of help. The challenge is really discerning the nature of those supports, and that's a key task for the team. So there's some guiding questions here that can help facilitate this discussion. Things like what would help in the next few months? What kind of help would you need in the next few months to connect you with a job? Like things like help with applications, or talking to employers, or finding job openings, or practicing interviews, or creating a one-page profile or a resume. Do you have a state ID? It says Tennessee in our state, but it would be a local ID as well, or a passport. Do you have a social security card? And are there other people like friends or neighbors or relatives or other people who your family knows who could help? And the other thing is students are going to need help on the job as well. Certainly that's true for our students, but it's really true for many students with developmental disabilities more broadly. So you might ask, what supports or accommodations do you need at the job? Assistive technology, sort of picture prompts, help from a coworker, or help from a job coach. And who would provide these different supports? So what supports would you need on the job? What do you do when you need help with a task? What happens when you get frustrated? And are you currently receiving any kind of support from outside agencies that perhaps we could draw into this process of supporting you on the job? Well, all these questions should lead to a rich discussion about potential job opportunities. And for each of the 3 jobs that interest the student, and certainly you can include more as well, but for each, at least for 3 of those, brainstorm together. What are some of the places in our community that a student could have a job like this? And what could help the students get connected to that kind of employer? And who would provide support to the student in the areas of obtaining a job and on the job, or getting to and from the job? Now, every job possibility will require different considerations. So draw upon the following questions when we're thinking about the supports and resources the student might need for each of these different job options. For example, where does the high school already have connections in the community that could help the student achieve their employment goals? And those connections might come through your CTE teachers, for example. Does the amount of help a student may need depend on the type of job that they have? And what roles will the student play in connecting this job, or family members, or teachers, or even a business or employer liaison? And are there jobs on this list that might be easier or harder to connect to than others? This page of the planning tool will really guide, that'll be your guide for job development and the recruitment of needed supports. It's kind of your roadmap in a sense. Well, step 6 involves thinking ahead to life after high school. We know these early work experiences should really foreshadow and ultimately lead to later employment goals after graduation. So consider some of these questions for your discussion. What would you like to do after high school? Do you think you might want the same job after high school that you obtain now or in the near future? Are you planning to apply to a post-secondary education program? And there are growing numbers of those for students with intellectual disability. And what supports do you think you would need from those adult agencies or others? And are you or your family already connected to these supports, or would you be interested in us helping you connect before you graduate? And of course, the final section addresses other concerns or questions that warrant attention. For example, things like, is there a support or need that we didn't discuss today that could be beneficial for you? Did everyone get a chance to share their opinions about the employment goals and plans for this year? Were there any areas that were not agreed upon, or any parts that seem still unclear? And do you and your family have questions about disability-related benefits that might need to be addressed? At the bottom of this is a place for everyone to sign, and it just provides some kind of accountability for moving forward on the responsibilities that you identified for each of the people who are part of this work. Well, let me just kind of begin to wrap up here with sharing some tips for job development that we've learned from families and schools that we've partnered with, as well as a few of our own. And the first is, you want to have a clear description of what job tasks or jobs a student's interested based on their feedback. And then confirm with a student that they're still interested in the 3 job options that were discussed during the employment planning meeting. Third, contact PREETs or VR or other potential disability service providers who could help in providing some of these on-the-job supports. And so that's really important to determine this before you contact employers, because I think employers often ask what supports are going to be needed or provided for a student. Fourth, call employers about job openings and discuss what makes a student a good fit for a job. And of course, follow the steps that are outlined in other resources. Some managers may prefer email. Make a note of their email address and preferred communication, and keep this along with addresses and phone numbers and managers' names as you track this as well. Well, fifth, employers, if they have hesitations or questions, offer the opportunity to discuss any further concerns or set up a meeting between the employer and the student. And this can be different than an interview. It could just be a chance to discuss job supports or do a tour of the workplace, anything that might help alleviate any concerns or hesitations that an employer might have. And then determine if and how a student needs to complete an application. You might want to make sure a resume or a one-page profile is completed if that's needed for an application. And if it's going to be online, make sure to note any usernames or passwords as you track your progress here. And then schedule an interview. You have to determine if an interview needs to be modified in some way. You might advocate for a working interview where a student really demonstrates that they know that they can do the job effectively, but they may not interview well. And of course, if the employer requires any skills aptitude tests, can the student have additional time or accommodations? So these are things that really need to be discussed before scheduling the interview. And so the employer is aware of any kind of needed or accommodations in advance, really. And then prepare for that interview. Interview clothing. Do they have the right clothing for an interview? Practice potential interview questions with your students in advance. Make sure they can advocate that they're interested in the job or communicate that. And that they can answer questions about their availability or schedule needs or preferences. Help the students also come up with questions that they can ask the employer. And then, if appropriate, attend the interview with the employer if it's requested or appropriate. And of course, make sure the student's bringing their resume or one-page profile to that interview. And so those are all really important things, to really be thinking about in this process. And finally, ask the employer for a good time regarding following up on the position to see if a hiring decision has been made or if additional feedback is needed in some way as well. So is it possible to find students paid jobs in the community before graduation? Absolutely. In the first year of our project, which we're just wrapping up, 75% of students with significant disabilities who had this kind of employment-focused planning meeting and they had some people assisting with job development, 75% of them landed an individualized paid job in the community. The other students are pretty close, but the journey can sometimes take time for students as well. Now, of course, you want to make sure that students obtain a job, but you also want to make sure that it's of high quality. And so how might you evaluate the experiences that your students are getting? Now, Paul Wayman and his colleagues have developed a really nice set of quality indicators that are related to competitive integrated employment among transition-age youth with disabilities. So you as a teacher could use it to reflect on the quality of the employment services that you're providing to youth with disabilities. It talks about things like using benefits planning. We know that effective planning requires reviewing issues related to the receipt of disability benefits that come from, for example, Social Security Administration or other public programs. So working and receiving disability benefits, they're not mutually exclusive, but you should request some kind of written benefits analysis. And there are people in your state who do that. Second is the individualization of job goals. And this really connects back to our webinar on high quality assessment. Each student's job skills are going to look different, and their goals are going to look different. And so having a person-centered planning process makes sure that the student's employment goals reflect their interests and preferences and strengths and needs, and that student's voice really remains prominent throughout the whole process. Third is the quality of competitive employment. And a number of common metrics can be considered when thinking about the quality of a job. For example, does it pay at least minimum wage and ideally more? Does it provide enough hours for the student? Does it provide the needed benefits? And is the employer satisfied with a student's job performance? All things that you can gauge by talking with the employer and looking at these kinds of metrics. Fourth is the consistency of job status with that of their students' coworkers. And so a really important indicator of the quality of an employment experience is the consistency between what coworkers are doing and what the students with significant disabilities are doing. Are their wages and benefits commensurate or comparable? Are there similar opportunities for job advancement? And fifth is the idea of making sure employment is in integrated job settings. Students with significant disabilities, they can and they should work in typical businesses right alongside coworkers who don't have similar disabilities. There should be opportunities for interactions with others during the job, but also on breaks or even after hours. And sixth is the quality of job supports and job site supports and fading. Students with significant disabilities often need additional supports that are beyond what their coworkers probably require. So those supports should meet the needs of youth and be offered in ways that support rather than set apart our students. In other words, we need a clear plan for support during that initial training, but also beyond that training throughout their experience. And that plan should really include steps to fade back our formal support over time as our students gain confidence and competence on the job. And finally, they talk about the presence of ongoing support services for job retention, but also for career advancement. Long-term success on the job requires long-term supports on the job. And this could include having a job coach who periodically visits the job site to monitor employment stability, or ensuring to help strengthen natural supports, or identifying pathways to career advancement over time. Getting a job is one thing, but keeping that job is quite another. And so you might think about how you draw upon this checklist when you're evaluating the jobs that your students obtain before graduation, and for service providers, the jobs they obtain after graduation as well. So promoting early work experiences for students with significant disabilities, yes, it's challenging work, but it's so important work if we're committed to elevating long-term outcomes. And so I hope this webinar has provided you with some ideas for planning and for practices that you might undertake in your school, so that more and more of your students have experienced the benefits and the joy of having a great paid job in the community, a satisfying job that aligns with their interests, and a job that propels them deeper into the world of work over time. So thank you for your investment in this area and for being part of this webinar.